Can I do this?
Good morning.
Good morning, Jack. I'm John Perretti, and I'm going to be interviewing Jack today. We'll call this the Jack and the Beanstalk episode. We had a prior talk for a couple of hours, and my goal was to ask Jack, what is it that you do? And we got in there and we got to hear him, and in a different way, because he doesn't have to lead the show. And I think it was really important for listeners who I hear asking all the time, what is it you do? And now this is the second part. And the second part for me is, why do you do it? Because I think it's the A and the B of this, which will probably lead into a C, but I just find it so interesting because I've known you for debatably 27 years, and the amount of focus that you have is incredible, and it's almost like no sentence can be said in your presence without it being pulled to the direction of your lifetime focus, or maybe not lifetime, but that is my first question. So when did you start?
Well, I start like all of us today, where I am. And the thread of this focus is noticing that given the free will we have as humans, that we have the freedom to create circumstances that appear to happen to us and condemn us and attack us, rather than be seen as a misappropriation of thinking, that we use the excuse that it's happening to us and condemning us to avoid responsibility for that misappropriation. If we have the freedom to create condemnation, then we're obviously exercising the right we have to that freedom. But to think then that what's wrong are the thoughts and the ego and the people and the places and the things, rather than what we're doing, is a major misstep in the whole calculation. If we're free to think those things and create condemnation, then we're really, first of all, wrong to begin with, because the thinking that does that wouldn't be right to have it appear to be something we're not doing, because it would disqualify us and our existence from having anything to do with what we're creating. And that would be a major gap.
Okay, I'm going to just stop you. The question is when?
When?
Chronologically, when did you start thinking about this thinking?
Well, I've been thinking as long as I've been thinking. So whether I've seen it clearly, the clarity of it, I mean, I think when I was young, I felt that there were things that were out of place. It took me till sobriety that I started to see that a lot of what was out of place was what I was doing in my own thinking. That gave me a bit of a windfall. I'd seen it before through the S training and LSD and other little excursions I had taken, when I started to actually recognize that there was something more expansive than the limitations of my thoughts. And so, I would say it's been going on, certainly for as long as it's going on. I don't have a date, and I don't think of it in those terms.
So your age of 66 or now 67 now. Yeah. So your age 67, and you're talking about your teenage isms. So we get a little bit just better handle on what. So when did sobriety occur?
I was 31, 1987, August.
So that's a pretty big gap there. And you've talked about before, but what I'm trying to see here is that your early recollections of things not being quite the way that they seem? Well, tell me about that.
Well, I remember being very disturbed when I was very young, like in my single digits, and I was very troubled, and I caused a lot of trouble just to distract myself from the inner conflict. The I'm not sure I had everything assessed correctly, but I would say whatever the assessment was, whether I was aiming it and blaming it on the right thing, is somewhat irrelevant, because the fact was it was disturbing and I felt displaced and I had all those sort of somatic experiences. What I have come to realize and come to learn, I think, the best of my thinking and the best of my assessment, is that that sense of displacement and that sense of wrong and that sense of not belonging comes from thoughts that don't have any place, that are wrong and that don't belong, because they're not right, they're not true, they're not real, they're not accurate. And my sense is the primary struggle for humanity is making believe that we can create reality and truth out of our thinking, rather than see thinking as an expression of it, just like nature expresses that knowing nature. It doesn't.
So when
an oak tree doesn't become a walnut tree because
Right.
it decides one day it wants to start a new career.
I've heard that from you. When you talk about trouble, what are you referring to?
Acting out, doing things I was told not to do, lighting the forest on fire the day after my mother said, don't play with matches at 4 years old, and sitting in a golf cart that my father said, don't touch anything. And when he walked away and I was wrapped in a blanket, and I said, well, I can do what he just did. And I pressed on the accelerator and ran the thing into a brick wall at full speed, took my upper lip off, did the same thing when he left me in a running car.
But a little more speed?
Well, fortunately, he was just coming out of the grocery store and ran behind the car with the shopping bags and somehow was able to stop it before somebody could get in and put it back into park. But the point was, I was almost enticed to do only things I was told not to do, and I was somewhat bored to do the things I could do. So there was clearly something going on in my experience that was a little lopsided and a little disproportionate to the events occurring, that I was capitalizing on, almost those chances to do what I was told not to do. It seemed to me in a lot of cases what I was told by adults not to do were things they enjoyed doing, and that always seemed a little perplexing to me. My father liked to drink. Certainly that wasn't something I was encouraged to do very young, but it seemed to be a high point in his experience and the people he was with that had them happier, but also not wanting anything to do with the kids at the same time. There was a sort of disconnect there. But I saw it.
Sorry, what about mom?
She never drank, never smoked, never did any of that. She was very straight and religious and Christian Zionist, and spent a lot of time, talking about the infinite and the omnipotent and omniscience and all those sort of absolute states were things I was exposed to when I was, in the single digits. And I found it fascinating because it was expansive to my thinking. It gave me something to ponder that pulled me away from the narrow thoughts and the narrow troubles I seem to manage so well.
That must have been wonderful, because considering our age, this was in where?
Michigan originally, Detroit.
Michigan. So that must have been wonderful, because considering our age, there wasn't a lot of refreshing conversation going on.
Well, in the 60s, I think a lot of stuff got refreshed, but I think inevitably it was a drug-induced flurry of ideas that ended up being very conflicted because of the overuse of drugs and alcohol and the party scene. The rock and roller, the greatest rock and rollers died, and all of a sudden the roots of that revolution that was really about peace and love and organic farming and communal living and community and all that stuff was really infiltrated by a lot of ideas that were based on an alteration of experience. And I picked that up and I saw that and I thought it was the revolution. I thought drinking and using was part of that revolution. And I got onto that bandwagon as quickly as I could.
Well, I have a very good friend of mine who I still speak to. He kind of sided with an ex-wife in an odd way, but who you also know, who always talked about, how Nixon squashed the revolution with this incredible drug called Quaaludes that, all of a sudden disappeared as quickly as it appeared and was basically free. And every time I think of that, he's a brilliant man, and I think about that a lot in my writing. But and now to move away from action and about thought, because I mean, how did
Thought is an action.
I meant physicality, like driving trucks and driving carts and driving cars. That's what I meant. But that's a perfect example of what I spoke about in the introduction. That focus of yours.
Well, my sense is if we're talking and we're actually addressing things, looking at them as accurately as possible would actually make greater sense than making believe a culture of denial and numbness to our own sensibility and sensitivity and sentient nature would be the goal. And
yes.
So I do what I can to mention, like, there's no voluntary action we ever take that doesn't start with a thought.
Mm-hmm.
So all those things you mentioned, driving, whatever we're doing, walking, talking, saying, whatever we're doing is all coming largely from a thought. So if our thinking is imbalanced,
Mm-hmm.
and we think what we need to do is focus on the imbalance to straighten it out, rather than to look at something that's in perfect balance and start to notice that the nature of nature is in balance and the nature of whatever would be absolute is in perfect order, and start to think in terms that are larger than the bits and pieces we seem to think are so complex, it would straighten out and simplify a lot of that other thinking so that we could be more functional and useful as humans together, collectively, as a species working on the same basis of survival, rather than an idea that we need to each survive desperately from the threat of each other, which is largely what tends to go on in society.
So what I have to do is stay on point, and that's why I'm asking questions from my notes. So forgive me for
maybe you could make the point and we could discuss
backing
that.
up. Well, my point is that right now I would like to hear a little bit about, mom's religion. What do we call that?
She called it, or they call it, Christian Science, which was
Christian Science.
Was about
So,
recognizing that the mentality drives disease.
But that's got to be, I mean, from where I was born, and my mother was on her knees Lutheran. That's got to be pretty refreshing for you as a young man to hear someone who's out there. I would have looked forward to that.
Yeah, well, it had its, I used to say to her in the church, was always a gold leaf, and this went back to Michigan. I used to go to church with her in Birmingham, and it would say God is love on the wall. And I always wondered why the people involved didn't act that way.
What do you mean?
Well, the people who ran the church, I always got into, if I tipped my seat back, I'd get kicked out of Sunday school. I mean, for the slightest infraction of what that was seen as right, I would be excommunicated from being able to participate. And I was certainly restless.
You're talking about the rigidity.
Yeah, and that's, we're coming out of the 50s. So the 60s hadn't really started, and the 60s sort of blew stuff apart. But in the 50s, there was a lot of convention and a lot of ideas that seemed to be true that I never suspected were true at all. I just thought that they were irritating and annoying and unjustified. So I saw the two of those things simultaneously. In one instance, I could actually float in my own thinking about things pretty expansively, but in my interactions with things, I saw that sort of expansiveness didn't seem to convey very quickly or easily. And that was always a little daunting to me, and part of that sense of displacement. And I'm really not talking about then, I'm talking about my perception of then now given the culmination and accumulation of all the moments that have occurred that have led to this moment, is really just a present tense awareness of everything that's ever happened. So all the other interactive things that I've been involved in have led to the thoughts I have about way back then, which obviously now have less to do with then and much more to do with the accumulation of everything that's happened since then.
Mm-hmm. So but the kid, how did he see the himself in the church?
You know, as a kid in church, I don't really, I mean, I don't.
Not physically, but how did you put yourself? Just try to describe how you put yourself cognitively within this structure.
You know, I would listen, and what would distract me were the rules and regulations that seemed, the stiffness and the rigidity that seemed to come along with it did not seem to align with the mentality I was aware of.
So you were critical.
I think I felt more upset than critical, yes, because I think I saw it as a clear, distinct issue. But I think I was upset by the sense of disconnect and the inability to overcome this sort of, in one sense, this effusive potential to think of things in omnipotent, omniscient, and absolute ways, was then seemingly infiltrated by behaviors that did not reflect any of those things. Seemed to be very, very stilted and very guided by an appearance of how things were, rather than a substantive awareness of that could be shared openly, regardless of what I wore and how I sat and how I operated. And I would say that's more of what I do now, and why I do what I do, because my sense is this has been hamstringing humanity's ability to function fully to our actual human capacity, based on this sort of inner conflict that completely derides the individual maintaining it, making believe it's something happening to them rather than actually being caused by them.
So you had a search for the truth, right? I mean, that was important to you?
Well, searching for it would suggest it isn't true, and only when I find it does it become true. So that shift for me was significant, to begin to realize that if something's absolute, it's absolute. It doesn't come and go. It doesn't operate the way we do in this spatially driven fourth dimension that we operate in. It doesn't have a here and there. It doesn't have a here and now. It's just a present state of being that is always present and always that same state of being. It doesn't change. And
yeah, I understand how you think now, because we went through that pretty heavily. But how did he think about that then?
Whatever. I don't try to even surmise. It would just be guessing. He isn't there and he isn't doing that now, so it's irrelevant to me. What I sense is,
but it's not irrelevant to me, because we structure and the growth in structure, you know, is well, for me, about environment, and since I'm so inquisitive of how the structure started.
Well, then aim your inquisition at the start point now, since this is actually that point you're looking for then that isn't happening now. And now actually is the culmination of all the thens that have ever been. Everything that's ever happened is actually the reflection of the momentary experience that we each have exactly where we are. So if we think the past is in the past, we're thinking of it incorrectly to think of it as somewhere other than where we are. And it seems to then be impossible to ever correct, because it's sitting somewhere else when all that ever is exactly where it always is now. So if you're looking for the start point, we're in it. We're there.
I understand, but you know, forgive my prehistoric kind of view of things. But what I really want to know is how Jack became Jack.
Well, I don't think I became anything. I think I've always had, as we always have, an absolute state of being that is knowing and aware and has always been those things. And those disturbances I experienced when I was young are the same disturbance I experience when I'm older. And that is that if I didn't have a sense of clarity on what is right, I would have no clarity on what's wrong. I would have no clarity of what's disturbing. I would have no clarity of what's conflicted. It would all seem normal and natural. And my experience is that we have gone to such great lengths as a species to try to normalize what's abnormal and become comfortable, desensitize what we're sensitive to, and become comfortable with what's discomforting, that we have numbed our actual capacity to be aware physically and acted as though it's something that is natural, which it is not. It's an abnormal, dysfunctional, disaffected attempt to make believe that all that we are is what we think. And to make believe thinking is all that we are is to make believe that thinking is the creator of reality and truth, which means all I am is what I think. And if thinking is always changing, I'm never what I just was, so I'm never what I am now for any longer than the infinitesimal amount of time it takes for a moment to change, which isn't any amount of time at all, because in the infinite state of infinitesimals, there is no distance between things. It's just immediate. It's always present. So I can't even become something. I can't even be something at one point and not be that thing at the other point. And my focus is looking at that and saying, if that exists and that is our present state of knowing, then that is our present state of what we all share presently with each other, always have, and nature, and anything that would be supreme to what we think of as nature, anything we call higher, which I wouldn't say higher, because if it's immediate, it's with us where we are. It's not a come or go here and there element. So if there's any aim, I would say that's the aim. And to try to flush it out in the stories of old, which really aren't happening, is to once more be distracted by ideas about how things happen rather than what is happening, where what is happening is in fact all that is happening, and what was thought to be is just a thought about something not happening. And I would say that's a major undermining of the potential to actually explore and look and see clearly.
I understand that you're having difficulty with my process, but
No,
but
I'm not having a difficult time with it. I'm just pointing out what you would like to do, if you really want to do that, might be worth doing it where we are, how we are, as we are now, and think of it as something that is the culmination of all that history. That history is present with us now. So it isn't history. It's actually present, dynamic, alive. Those memories are present. We'd never think of things that aren't present. There is no anything that isn't present. There is no past other than in thought. And if the thought is the idea that it's back there somewhere, I'm sitting here now thinking somehow I'm immobilized in my capacity to reckon with and facilitate that experience I had as a present culmination rather than as some past thing that isn't actually even happening, other than the thinking I'm trying to do about it to come to some form that might compete with the present state of being, which includes everything that's happening, not just some things somewhere else. So
there's a lot of words that you use over and over and over and over again. And I have an idea of, is there a bad natural and a good natural?
Well, I would say if we assign those words to things, it's based on whether something is productive, beneficial, and useful in good sense. And if it's bad, it would be something that's not beneficial, not functional, and not useful, something that doesn't work. And I don't think of those terms as guiding principles as to what something is, because what something is what it is. But in terms of human functional capacity, if we're constantly relying on bad ideas, the chances are we're going to starve, and we're not going to get enough water, and we're not going to be breathing deeply enough, because we're going to create a situation that is so filled with anxiety and fear just from the threat we're creating that it will make no sense to do the most sensible things, and it will make all the sense in the world to do the things that make no sense. And I would say we're witnessing that on a pretty broad scale today. There's enough people now to make that obvious.
Yeah, that's really what I like about this direction. So you talk about reality and truth. So those are positives, right?
I don't think they take either position, because they're a culmination of all. The basic makeup of the molecule is positive and negative, and neutrons. It's all of it. It isn't some of it. And to look at everything is to start see that the individuation of things doesn't even exist, because everything that's interacting is interacting with everything else, and wouldn't exist if it weren't interacting with everything else. So the idea that they're separate and alone is the same idea we have when we start to cultivate thoughts about things that aren't true as being true, and start wondering why we have a sense of disconnect and less than, and because our thinking is less than and disconnected from reality, which would be inclusive and total and seamless and complete and whole and absolute, meaning it doesn't change.
So what is not, oh, sorry.
The only way I can see things not changing is to think of everything rather than some things. And when I begin to recognize the nature of everything is everything, which includes everything I can't see both with my eyes and I can't hear with my ears, whatever everything would include not only all things, but any existence, presence, state of being that wouldn't be a thing, because it wouldn't be something amongst other things. It would just be a present state, which I would suggest is the present that we're sharing right now.
So what is not true?
I don't know if anything isn't true, but I know that delusion can imagine things not true to be true. And a lie think of a lie. We've gone over this a lot of different times. A lie only exists as long as it's thought to be what it isn't, which is true. So a lie is not a lie. It's conceding what it is, so it is what it is. There's no conflict. As long as I maintain an idea that's not true, this idea doesn't really exist in reality. It simply exists in imagination. And my creative capacity, like our human creative capacity, allows us to imagine, just like it allows us to think whatever we want. We are free to think. We are free thinkers. So that means I can imagine something I imagine becomes reality and truth, which in that the basic premise, if there is reality and truth, that would suggest that to the extent of my thought, truth is real and true. But when it comes to my thought, there's an exception to reality and truth, making what is real and true not true, at least within the realm of this thought I'm having that I think is true.
Mm-hmm. So give me ideas of what's true.
Well, I simplify it by just suggesting that truth is true.
Okay, but you can't define something with something, give me something else.
You can define it in absolute terms that way. And the complexity of our human experience tends to come from trying to over-define it in ways that it actually isn't, which is why it's never resolved. It's always been a seeking and a looking to define it further. And thousands and thousands and thousands of books have been written to try to explain what's going on in newer ways, and yet it still leads to more and more of the same attempts. The fact is that truth would be something that is inviolable, immutable, indivisible, always present, always available, always in reach. The absolute nature of being would be truth. Now it would also be reality. It would also be in my estimation,
water or mountains or anything.
No,
it's pretty
mountains
vague.
change, water changes. Those things as a reflection within nature, yes, they're all based on the exact same knowing principle. Knowledge would be part of what I would think truth is. Knowledge, not thinking.
Knowledge can be bent, though, can it?
In thoughts, everything can be bent, and that's exactly what happens when we start having these vicious cycles of thought occurring that are obsessive, is a bent thought trying to straighten itself out. It's literally going around and around and around in circles, thinking that someday if I think more about it, think longer about it, think harder about it. This is exactly what we do with drugs and alcohol and sex and food and gambling when we're addicted. We want more and more and more and more and more of the thing that's killing us as a solution to the problem, when in fact it's actually not the solution at all. It's seen as a solution because I'm trying to distract myself from the thinking that has caused the problem. Rather than admit I'm the cause of it, I continue to use something else and blame it, the gambling, the sex, the coke, the whatever it is.
So give me something that's make-believe, because we use that a lot.
Well, that truth isn't true, I would say, is make believe. I mean, if truth is truth, then truth, not truth, would obviously be a thought that we can have and we can entertain. And the idea that I can create my own truth is a thought that I'm welcome and have the right to maintain. But the distinction between thoughts that are right and thoughts that are wrong is the consequence, which we always face. Speaking of nature, nature's consequence it's like our textbook for human realization and actualization of human capacity. If we are thinking something that's wrong and believing it's right, which is one of your points and focuses, there's no thought I have that I maintain that I don't have belief is true. I don't just maintain thoughts randomly that I know are wrong, because I would know that they're never going to apply to anything and I wouldn't bother trying.
Sorry.
I have belief in thoughts that I think are true. And so my application of them fails, and consequence gives me an accurate assessment, along with my own sense of inner conflict and doubt and uncertainty and all those byproducts, that the anxiety and stress that are created in my own experience. When I'm looking at those accurately, I'm assessing what's happening not only in my thinking, but my entire environment accurately. And I start seeing where my dysfunctions are being caused by my thinking, rather than seeing them as being happening to me and out of my control. I start seeing that I'm absolutely directly responsible for those. I'm creating them presently, not in some past time that I'm now lingering with. It's present maintenance. Nothing happens outside the present of presence. Thinking we're not in the present is a very popular conception, but that means thinking would be more powerful than time and space. And the entirety of the fabric of the universe would be undermined by the idea that we're not where we are. It's impossible.
Yeah. Impossible to be not where we are?
Yes.
So,
possible to be where we are and think we're not where we are. But again, that shows how much credit we give thinking and the impressions it creates to justify it being real and true, when the only thing it does is cause disturbance and pain that we then use to justify, if it didn't hurt, it wouldn't exist. The fact that it exists proves, the pain proves it's real. Pain doesn't prove it's real. Pain proves something is wrong. That's what pain is for. It's to indicate something is wrong.
So what is the difference between right and wrong?
Workability and non-workability, function and dysfunction.
You mean in what sense? Like
if you try to
whether
apply
it proceeds
wrong,
or it doesn't?
If you try to apply wrong, it's going to go wrong. If you try to apply right, it will work. Now,
well, that sounds very much like church.
I don't know how, but
well, because you're do what I'm telling you to do, and everything's going to be fine. If you don't, you'll be all alone and you'll be unhappy. And
this doesn't have anything to do with being told. This has to do with the fact of what we discuss is accurate. Then you already have a knowing state of being that knows as well as I do what is right and what is wrong. And I would say the reason that we're capable of even noticing right and wrong as humans, that being nature doesn't think in right and wrong terms, because it doesn't think. It's an absolute state of knowing. If our clarity within our thinking can be so great as to recognize what's wrong and then make believe what's wrong is right, we're missing the fact that we're getting really good information and then doing what we can to overcome it with our thinking, by thinking we're not thinking what we're actually thinking and witnessing what we're actually witnessing. And that, I would say, is a major disruption and undermining of human capacity, and also a generator of all the indignation and righteous indignation and irritability and discontent that we seem to have with everyone else, when in fact we're living in those actual states in our own existence, not wanting to admit, I'm doing it. I'm the cause of it. I'm the actual creator of that. And now I'm using everyone like I use my thoughts as being intrusive and attacking me as though they're happening to me. I start using everyone else to also infill that justification as I'm a victim. I can't be responsible in any absolute way and also be a victim. Two do not work together.
And all that occurred because of the make-believe part. Is that not true?
Well, I'm just suggesting that belief by its nature, if we knew something, we wouldn't need belief. So if truth is knowing, there is no belief in it that actually confirms it. But if we actually believe we can do something and then we do it, and the belief leads us in a direction of accomplishing something, there is some indication that actually relying on faith, if we're relying on faithful things, if we're trusting in trustworthy things, if we're believing in believable things, actually gives us a chance to express those things rather than just be apathetic and sit back and not ever act or try. So this isn't about only acting right. It's about noticing that whether we act right or wrong, we're given immediate consequences that give us an indication of how well we're doing in relation to what we're doing. How well-being are we? How being well are we in that process? And like a sailor at sea never can predict every little nuance of what's going to happen. They're generally doing what they can to adjust the ship in a direction to get where they're going. Never in the identical, precise direction that was imagined, always in the direction that occurs as it occurs. And that is what my experience is. Consequence offers us, is a constant feedback, a mirror of whether we're actually operating in sync with what's happening or we're operating in opposition to what's happening. Whether we think our thinking is the dominant source or the dominant source of the source is dominant, and we just happen to be byproducts of that thinking. So I can either be expressing that knowingness, or I can be making believe, which is what all delusion is make believe. It's fantasy. It's the idea that an illusion becomes true and real is what delusion is. So there's nothing wrong with the delusions. There's nothing wrong with belief. But when I make believe, my make believe becomes reality. Now I'm basing reality on something I've created. Again, my thinking becomes the creator of reality. Can't be true if reality is reality. There isn't any room for reality to be filled any greater than what it already is. We can express it and we can transform it, but we don't ever make it. We don't make it up. All we do is transform things that already exist into new forms.
So what is faith?
I would say a reliance on something that is unprovable, often. Something that someone has no confidence in. I'll tell you what the dictionary says.
Wasn't faith the intensity of the belief?
Well, it could certainly, I mean, if you have faith in belief and belief is unbelievable, then you are having faith in something that's faithless. And I would say that's exactly how obsessive thought gets set in motion, because it gives the impression that more and more thinking will finally fix the problem when it's the thinking of the thing that's faithless and having faith in that faithless thing that's causing the problem. If we can't see the simplicity of what's going on in the immediacy of it, we're very likely going to launch a ship in 1,000 different directions to try to recover from it, when in fact we've never bothered to notice that the anchor has not been pulled up from the ship. The anchor is that first thought, that primary thought. And I would suggest the primary thought is that thoughts can be, if you look at each thought, we can try to break them all down and discuss for another million years everybody's thoughts, but it will never deal with everybody's thoughts. It'll just deal with all the single thoughts people seem to be struggling with. If we look at thinking as something we do in total, becomes a little easier to notice that if we're not thinking correctly about what's actually happening, the chances are what we're thinking about won't have any basis in reality that's going to be useful or productive for anyone at any time. And that would be a major glitch in our system. If my thinking is thought to be truth and reality, then I immediately think who I am is all I think. And if who I am actually is a being of knowing nature, and what I think is something I do, I now have completely attempted to hijack and usurp my absolute state of knowing for what I think I know, and what I think I am, and what I think everyone else is. And so I don't hear anybody else. What I hear from them is what I think they're saying. And I don't see anybody else. I see of them what I think I'm saying. And all of a sudden, the world becomes only what I think, because I become the master of this world, not realizing that if I can be the master, so too can everyone else. And if I think I'm in charge, so too is everyone else. And now I have chosen to fight with everybody and everything everywhere on the basis of simply thinking incorrectly about my thinking, rather than seeing if I have any mastery, it's the freedom I have to let go of any thought that is wrong, to not pursue it any further, and to use those signs that come up as opportunities to adjust accordingly so that I can continue sailing, rather than get into these pitched battles and generate problems that seem to be intractable simply to distract myself from the thing that I'm maintaining and manifesting on that problematic level, all coming from thought.
So where do you think the big book fails in thinking?
I don't. I think the big book was written with enormous clarity, well beyond what is generally interpreted. And my sense is that what is thought of it is often thought of it as something to help stop drinking, rather than see that it's really a guide to complete freedom in all respects for all people, not just those afflicted with any individual symptomatic behavior. Because ultimately, it's revealing that the addictive process problem is in the mind. It's just in the thinking. The mental obsession is that symptom caused by making believe who I am. If I have belief in something that's unbelievable and I have faith in something that's faithless, I've got to think about it full time to ever believe it will come true. And it will never come true. That's an obsessive thought. Constantly trying to fix something that isn't even broken, except for the thinking I'm doing about it, I'm maintaining in the present.
Which is belief.
Well, it's belief and faith and hope and agreement, starting to collect other people who think like me and think because I've got a posse of people that say, yeah, I think like you too, I'm better off. And what I do is become more delusional about creating this appearance that I'm better off, when in fact, I'm only getting better at being worse because I'm not dealing with the problem. I'm trying to feel better about the problem, which means the problem, like any disease, would grow.
So where do you take the big book further? Because I know you take the big book further. You're more focused.
Listen to what it says. He says that he says we turn to an infinite God rather than finite self.
Let's just talk about that sentence.
Okay.
What is he talking about?
Well, if who we think we are, and I don't think this was clarified as much, and I'm not sure because I run into a lot of contention within the community of people who are sober and such. But my sense is that when we think about our thinking of itself creates a self, but the self it creates is more thought. It doesn't create who I am. And we mistake that self for who we are. And to think that who we are is what we think is to think we are the creators of who we are. Now, we are the creators of the substance of our essence, but we're not at all, because it doesn't conflict with our essence. It only conflicts with our thinking. So if the problem is created in thinking, the suffering is done by the thinking, nothing else. Does it mean that it has no other side effects? No. There's great side effects that occur to our body. Our body is put in peril by the anxiety and the stress that undermines all of the natural systems that we have, that you know the names of each of them, the nervous system and the, parasympathetic system and the metabolism and all these different cardiovascular systems. All these different systems are designed to work trillions of interactive capacities that we don't think about at all for the most part during the day until something really goes wrong. Then it gets our attention, because that attention, again, is drawn to something wrong. The pain isn't saying you're wrong. The pain is saying something is wrong somewhere within this system that you're managing, within this system that you've been given governance, that you're responsible for, the one I think in. That isn't my being. It's my thinking that's causing that problem. It's how I'm utilizing what I've been given. The same way, if I got into a car and never driven a car, the chances are I would run into something rather quickly because I wouldn't understand what any of the push buttons and the brake and all that stuff would be. No idea. I'd put it in reverse and punch the gas or hit the brake. All those things would be foreign to me. So I would misutilize them. My sense is we've been misutilizing thinking for so long that we think our nature is abnormal. We think our nature is to fight. We think our nature is to be conflicted. We think emotional turmoil is natural. We think all these things that we do are not, none of them are natural. We're trying to make them natural because it helps to avoid actually looking at the unnatural and the unhealthy and the unstable issues that we're creating.
So all these negative things in mankind, right? Well, or we can say, the evolved or devolved, or however you want to put judgments on it, but all these things are messed up because of our thinking.
Yeah, well, it's reality isn't messed up, and truth isn't messed up, and love isn't messed up, and the absolute nature of being isn't messed up. So nothing is really messed up except our delusional idea about who we think we are. And
Yes,
what that does is it puts our body, which is a manifestation of thought or consciousness, at
in
risk.
peril. Yeah.
So the thing our thinking is designed to do is to follow our instincts, to be guided in a direction to survive and thrive, which means we have more than we need, so we have plenty to give. If there's any shortcomings out there, it could easily be handled. Nature has always been limited to what's been on this planet, and everything we've ever had or done, to eat, to live in, to drive, whatever we've had has all come from nature so far. And nature is a developing thing, always offers itself and replenishes and takes care of itself if we get out of its way, better than the things we do to try to correct it very often. So there always seems to be enough. If we were thriving at our capacity, we would be happy to give away what we had because it would be a burden after it. We don't need it. What are we going to do? Give it to people. Why? That's the ultimate goal of interaction. If all things are interexchanging amongst all other things, then the thing we do best is this interchange that we have with each other, the potential to exchange and to offer and to give, not to give out of the vacancy of making believe that giving makes me feel better and I'm going to get something for it, but giving out of no expectation of anything other than it's the best thing I can do.
Kind of like service.
Yeah, it is. It's exactly what service is. And Dr. Bob said that all the steps boil down to love and service. And I would say love is the ultimate service because it doesn't take, it always has enough to give. I mean, the AA paradoxes are a great view into the absolute because one of them says, if we give it away, we keep it. Well, that seems very contrary to relative thinking, which would think if we gave it away, we wouldn't have it any longer. And so all of a sudden, what seems to be preposterous becomes not theoretical, but an actual experience people have when they actually begin sharing what they went through to get sober with others and see that other person start to get it because they're sharing something that they connect with. They're not sharing a foreign language. They're sharing an experience that can come in different places with different people at different times. And yet the underlying current is the same thing. I tried, I failed, I failed. I finally conceded. There was no fight to be had. There was no win to be gotten. And start to come to terms with what I'd been trying in sobriety was to drink and drink more to prove I had control. To say, look at me, I can drink a quart of tequila and I can still drive. I can still walk. I can still stand up. That to me proved I didn't have a problem with alcohol, but few people have ever drank a quart of tequila and survived. I mean, I don't know, maybe that's popular, but I can remember doing it.
Why do we war? Why do we war?
Well, it's an expression. We're trying to blame other people for what we're doing in our own conflicted. If who I am is not who I am, and I am living in my body with someone that is a foreign invader and an enemy because I'm creating an image of something that I think is real, I've got a world war going on because everything I'm going to see in the world is going to reflect this inner conflict of hatred and loathing and self-deprecation and all of the things, the lack of self-confidence and the lack of self-worth and the lack of self-value. All those things are going to be fighting to try to regain those things when in fact the fight is fighting with something that doesn't even exist except for the delusion I have about it. How am I going to feel better about it by treating it more and more and more and thinking there's even something to treat? It's not like somebody who's got a body that's wounded that could use some bandages. There's nothing there other than the thought I'm maintaining now that there's something there. Thinking about thinking creates more thoughts. It doesn't birth a being. It doesn't birth a who I am. It doesn't birth an essence. It simply creates more thoughts. I am welcome to think about my thinking, and I am actually designed to think about my thinking. That's contemplation, meditation. It's an awareness of what am I thinking, and what are the conflicts in what I'm thinking? What are the best ways I can deal with what I'm thinking so I can actually function at a level that's actually functional rather than dysfunctional? The basis of my thinking thinks who I am is what I think. That's a critical core corrupt seed in all the thinking I'm going to do, including justifying killing other people, which has always been done. Wars are always a failure of diplomacy, as Winston Churchill put it, meaning people can't simply understand what each other wants, so they're going to go to war to fight for it. They're going to enforce violently their opinion on others. That's all it ever is. That seems like a pretty shaky, we seem to be pretty volatile with what we think for it to be truth and reality, because truth and reality is perfect peace, perfect silence, perfect stability. It isn't disrupted. It isn't hateful. It isn't spiteful. It isn't contemptful. It doesn't have any need, doesn't think of itself. It just knows all that it knows. Very different premise to come from. Now, if for history we've been making believe that other people should tell us how to behave and how to be right, and not see that that rightness is a nature of our own awareness, and it isn't self-righteous. It's just the ability to be right, intuitively knowing what to do rather than thinking about it all the time, and thinking will eventually realize some truth that's already present. I'm denying the truth by making believe I can create truth. I'm actually, and you can't even deny something that's absolute. It's delusional to even think you can deny it.
Why is that?
Because the opposite of the infinite is infinite.
I understand the analogy, but that doesn't help me with the question.
Well, to begin to contemplate this will help you with the question, because you'll see that the limits of your thoughts that seem confounded are only thinking about it in relative terms rather than absolute terms. And that's part of the discussion, is to begin to think in infinite terms. And why I tend to repeat things over and over again is because they're the same things. They don't change. So thinking of them in new ways doesn't help. Thinking them in ways that can be contemplated, and say, if something's infinite, it's simply infinite. It means there's no room for there's no gap, there's no exception, there's no less than, there's no more than, there's no right or wrong, there's no good or bad. It is just an absolute state of being that, if exists, must be the basis of our existence, along with all of the nature that we seem to revel in and appreciate, and yet depreciate to the point that we see it as something distinct and apart from us, rather than an absolutely intimate reflection of us as we are of it.
You know, people, I'll speak for myself, but I teach for a reason, regardless from teaching as a college professor, or I'm teaching some kind of martial art, or artwork, or the artist that I am. Why do you teach?
I don't know that I teach. I just talk. And my sense is when people are interested in learning, my sense is the clearer I am, the clearer the reactivity of others becomes in my interactions with them. And I used to think avoiding that reactivity was the goal in life, so that I could make everybody happy, which was a false sense of correctness, I would say. And so when I started speaking openly, I noticed that a lot of people really reacted and were really upset. And what I saw was, it was giving them a chance to notice the reactivity and the upset that was generally being put to sleep by the ideas I used to think that I was going to make them feel better by acting in ways that made it easier for them to continue to deny what they were doing. And then I started to say, that's exciting. That's actually an adventure. That's an exploration.
What's exciting about that to you?
To actually communicate with somebody honestly.
It's kind of like, it's a stretch, but there's a personality to it that I'm trying to understand, because because it's my process, son. But there's an intellectual kind of aggression to it.
Well, think of some of the terms we use. Brutal honesty.
Right.
Honesty can't be brutal, but the impact it can have on somebody who's been brutalizing themselves with dishonesty can become clear.
Wait, wait. Back up. Go ahead. I want to hear that again.
We say things like brutal honesty.
Yes.
Okay. So honesty isn't brutal because it's absolutely accurate. Can't be brutal if it's what's happening. Yet, if someone is brutalizing themselves with dishonesty and they hear what's honest, what they begin to actually witness is their own brutality. And if I, in any clarity I can offer, gives anyone the chance to actually begin to witness their reactions clearly, rather than try to put them to sleep further and make believe what they're doing, I'm going to help conspire with them to help them feel less about what's actually happening. That hasn't helped yet through history. We've developed all sorts of cultural mores and manners and things we call tolerant. Why would we have to be tolerant if we weren't intolerant? Why would we have to be kind if we were actually kind? The fact is, we don't have healthy interactions. A lot of them are based on very, very caustic interreactions. And to try and solve that by thinking of it from the thinking standpoint, rather than beginning to look at it all, the same thing that Socrates and Aristotle came up with, which was, while everything changes, the one thing that doesn't change is that everything changes. You can't see that totality without looking at everything in its essence. And then as you look at things, they become very different because they're not now seen as distinct, but part of an absolute whole. And thinking in those terms is inclusive. There's no discrimination in that, no inequity in that. There's no separateness in it. There's no division in it. There's no fight in it. You can't have a fight in something that's indivisible because there aren't bits and pieces to war on and fight over. And all that we ever fight over is thoughts. What people think, what they should think, what we want them to think, what they should have thought.
So the reaction that the more honest reaction that people give you because of your I don't know what word to use, but because of your method, is actually a way for them to experience more truth.
Well, I would say if we're conspiring with them to keep them distracted from what they're doing, compared to facing them accurately and speaking in terms that are accurate and allowing them to have their experience, we're actually keeping from them the potency and the capacity of that experience and the clarity of seeing what they're creating. And so I don't think I ever teach anybody anything, but I expect people start looking at what they're doing slightly differently and start learning things that they've always known and come to terms with them, because when you align with something that's accurate, it doesn't tend to take a lot of thinking after that to utilize it. It just sort of finds its place like the key does the tumblers when it fits. And if that tumbler's off a little bit, that whole lock will not work or unlock. And in that regard, it's each of our own capacity to know. My suspicion is if there's an absolute knowing source, we all know that source. It doesn't mean we think we know it. And it doesn't mean we can think about it accurately in all respects, because if we've been thinking our thinking is knowledge for so long, there may be a little work, may take a minute to come to terms with all the thinking we've been doing that isn't correct. The cultural mores and the creeds and the values that we've seemed to try to enforce on people and insist they have, which may not be valuable at all. And yet it isn't up to me, it's up to each of us, because we each have the capacity to think for ourselves. Nobody can ever be told yes or no in relation to a thought. I can never insist anyone listen to me if they're unwilling. I can insist, but it's not going to make the difference, because they're going to do what they do the way they do it. And I'm going to be irrelevant to them. And I would rather not be irrelevant. I would rather be relevant. I would rather function in a way that gives them credit due for credit without even having credit, just knowing that knowing exists, knowing it's something we share, and begin to see them as that, so that the reactions I get aren't seen as anything aimed at me. I can just simply see they're struggling with whatever they're thinking. Very different. Doesn't impact me the way that it used to, because I'm not trying to avoid my own interreactiveness. I'm using it to notice the interreactiveness and concede the interreactiveness and start to allow it to dissipate in the acceptance of it and the willingness to have it and the allowance of it being what it is, as it is, honestly, rather than sort of deceptively in all the various ways that I've learned to do that.
So do you think that, being a great salesman has helped you with this tutelage?
I don't ever think I was a great salesman. I think I found people things they wanted and was a great facilitator in that regard. I mean,
well, your story's going back to telephone sales for hardware,
well,
or stationery or something.
That was all manipulation and lying and cheating. And, by 26, I was so sick in my stomach, I could never, I just couldn't do it anymore.
Yeah, no, that's what I'm talking about.
Yeah. I mean, that was just trying to achieve the American dream by having money and success financially, but being empty and hollowed out as a human.
Do you think that salesman in you helps with this tutelage?
If I thought people had something to buy, I might, but I don't know. I don't really know. I leave it to everybody. It's up to everybody to decide what they want to think. I'm not.
Yes.
I don't want to be, where it comes to absolute knowledge, I know that everyone knows. I don't think that includes them thinking the way I do, because the fact is we all have the right and opportunity to think freely whatever we want. So it's probably going to be that we're all thinking in ways that don't. I mean, I could convey something in absolute terms, John, and somebody could get it. But if they explained it, it might not seem like what I would say. But it doesn't mean they're not seeing that thing, because they're starting, if they're even addressing it, they're starting to interact with it. And the beginning of that interaction is the essential submission or concession to it, and starting to see, oh, this thing I've always known this. I just haven't been employing it. I haven't been utilizing it. I haven't been interacting with it. I've been doing everything I can to keep myself preoccupied with thoughts that have no basis, thinking somehow I'd sort all that out, rather than begin to concede that the basis has always been the basis. It's always been the fundamental aspect of existence. And that ease is the difference between what we call knowledge, thinking knowledge, and intuition. And intuition is described as knowing beyond reason, which means there's no thinking and no understanding involved at all. It's a knowing of knowing, and it's an awareness of awareness, something that would be absolute, and something that, if it is absolute, would absolutely be the essence of our awareness and our knowing, each of us.
So, I mean, I understand a lot about submission. I created 2 sports that ends in submission. Do you think your audience is masochistic?
I would say any of us who are entertaining thoughts that aren't true are masochistic, because the attempt to try to turn the pain into something that we want to live with is, I would say, pretty good definition of masochism or sadism, trying to get pleasure from pain. The idea that I can feel better about something I'm doing that's wrong is trying to desensitize myself by feeling something other than what's happening, which is just another manifestation of delusion. So I would say that there's an absolute masochistic, hateful, spiteful, contemptful core loathing that is ugly, that goes on inside of us, that I would say I tried to hide most of my life, and now see in many petty thoughts I have about people, places, and things during the day, every day, to some degree. And I see those critical thoughts and I say, well, I know that I have some core thoughts that I think are core and not in reach and not accessible and not available, that I haven't come to terms with. To do those things would be to admit those things simultaneously.
So those inside you beliefs, those core beliefs, change your perception, correct?
Well, I would say they create perception.
Okay.
So as the beliefs change, the perception changes, just to keep up with the belief so that it can still seem to be, keep in mind that perception isn't how things are, it's how we think things are. So if things are how they are, and all I'm doing is thinking about how they are, I'm not remembering that how they are is how they are, and thinking in terms that are simple enough to appreciate them. So my ideas about them are depreciated. meaning I'm not even seeing them. I'm seeing only what I think. So if my
Yeah.
relationship to everything is only based on what I think, I'm going to see everything in the same spiteful, loathsome ways that I think about the thinking I'm doing. Because if I know better, I don't feel happy about doing that. I don't feel confident about doing that. I feel confident about doing it. I don't feel any more confidence is going to help me do anything more than what's wrong. And most self-help treats that, tries to help us get more confident, more ambitious, and all those sorts of driving things that lead to success. But what is it we're trying to get confident over, but a lack of confidence and a lack of ambition? Why would those things exist as an anchor point if it isn't something that we're creating to then try to overcome and prove that we're in charge by overcoming the same thing we're creating? Why, if we can create it, we can uncreate it as quickly and overcome it by not even having it. And yet we think overcoming it is the goal while it's something we created to begin with. That's crazy. We're taking it seriously enough, to your point about belief. We believe the thing we're trying to overcome is real to even be overcome, rather than start to see it simply a thought that we've given a narrative to of some sort. It's like a story in our head that we tell, that we talk to about this self that we have. And we think that talking about it actually is a script, like a prescription for success, for feeling better, for getting more, for doing better. And it doesn't. It never, even when we get what we think we want, very often we're left wondering why we didn't get what we thought we wanted by having the thing we finally got.
So what is the absolute knowing source?
Whatever it is, it's I would say an ever-present state of being, an ever-present state of awareness, an ever-present state of knowing, something that is imperceptible within the visual realm. So it seems invisible, but being indivisible doesn't mean it needs to be visible to exist any more than everything beyond the horizon needs to be seen to be recognized as existing. And it starts to allow that, we don't actually see our thoughts. We actually witness their effects. I don't see where they're being created and made. It may be in my brain. It may also be in the cellular structure of my body. There's muscle memory and all kinds of stuff going on in our body that keep track of data and information. Stress.
You think muscle has memory?
I expect it probably does, from overuse and repetition.
I don't think muscle has any memory, but I have something else that so when you think about this thing that you do, and you've spoken about what it is a lot, which is great. What part of you motivates to do it again?
You mean to have the same conversation?
Yeah, to do it well. Obviously, they're going to be different, but
yeah,
to do it, yeah, to endeavor to persevere, as the coinage says.
Self-centeredness has the opinion, or creates the opinion, that what's good for me, that the only good is what's good for me individually, which means that it's not good for anybody else. And to think in absolute terms begin to become very obvious that everybody else is included in any good that can be done, and everyone else is included in all the bad that's done. And I mean everybody else. I don't mean some other people. I mean all other people simultaneously. And to think in absolute terms, it becomes pretty obvious that the potential we have to actually influence what's going on in ways that are meaningful and helpful and useful for everyone, not just someone somewhere, though it starts with someone somewhere, but also within the inclusive nature of recognizing that if it can help them, it's helping everyone. And everyone is buoyed by it. Like a ship floats, it rises with everybody on board, not just the people bailing water or on the upper deck. Everybody gets to go up with the ship. And starting to see things in that way, as I look out into the world, I see that there seems to be plenty to do. And if that's the case, I would like to continue to do plenty in that regard. Because my sense
is that important that you are one of the big ship?
Well, I don't know, but I am. And if that's the case, then we all are. And if we have a chance, I don't see it. I used to think of it as a daunting prospect, and I don't see it anymore. I only see it as a shift. Henry Miller said the only thing lacking in humanity, the only thing humans need is a change of heart. And I heard that at first and I thought, yeah, that's so simple. That's all that it really is. The fact is, if we've been fighting things so vigorously and collectively to make believe that those things are impossible to overcome, the fact is it takes very little effort to stop doing something that's insane and start actually reveling in the nature of all the freedom that comes automatically from that. And also that intuitive sense of awareness begins to question why we would ever do that again. And the sickness of insanity and the sickness of addiction is thinking that the only thing we can do is keep doing the thing that's killing us over and over again.
Is this perspective evolving or?
Well, I wouldn't say there's any evolution in something that's absolute. And yet I don't think when we think all we are is what we become, it's becoming to us as beings.
Yeah, but your projection of it over 25, 30 years, is that a perspective that's changing?
I would say my thinking about it is always changing, yes. My clarity.
Therefore, your thinking about your thinking is always changing too, right?
To a degree, yeah. Well, even if the only change is my place in space, I mean, think about the dynamic of the movement we're all sharing. We don't talk about this. We talk about the Earth, the sun going up and down, which it does not do. The sun is fairly stable, even though it's also moving with the solar system. But we're spinning all the time. We are moving through space all the time. We are moving at 1,000,000 miles an hour when you begin to consider the galaxy, and at 24,000 miles an hour in terms of the rotation. And then the orbit is moving at another, I forget what the number is, that we're always in motion. So if what I'm doing now is thinking the same thing, in some way within that relative context, I'm doing it from another point of view, another place. So I'm doing it in relation to everything else, always in a new place, always.
But mentally is what I meant, not physically.
Well, mental is physical.
Yeah, we started with that, but you see where I'm going.
Not yet.
I don't just struggle not to be obtuse with me. Again, this is a primitive perspective here for me. I know very little. So the thing I'm trying to say is that, yes, we're moving. Yes, we're treading water. The whole thing is moving. But mentally, is your perspective changing? You've been doing this a long time.
Again, perspective is a point of view. So, I'd have to go back. You asked me not to be obtuse, and I'm doing everything I can to be clear. The clarity may be revealing some of the obscurities of thinking that you're trying to sort out in the discussion. And I'm not suggesting that I'm clear enough to absolutely be certain that all that's happening is what you're thinking, because I'm certainly doing my own level of thinking. My experience is that if this absolute nature is absolute, you already know what I know, and you know what everyone else knows. And that to any degree, I try to foster a discussion that has to do more about what you're thinking than what you know, is to again engage you in a level of reason that's going to continue to perpetuate the ideas you have that you can always have and you're free to have, but would never feel like you need to resolve or be completed about if you're just having thoughts and having reasonable thoughts. And you can take them or leave them. Very different experience than when we think we have to get to the bottom of it.
I understand your position. What I just wanted to know if what you're doing now is the same as what you were doing then.
In a being sense, yes, and in a thinking sense, no. It's always changing.
Okay.
I would say
that's
that,
valid.
Yeah, the realm that we're in is all about change, and stability is my sense is if I engage with stability at an absolute level, my thinking doesn't seem so unstable anymore because it's doing what it does. It thinks and it changes. And all of a sudden it becomes something that's very utilitarian rather than the seeming albatross that I'm trying to fix all the time and trying to keep stable, when in fact it's always moving, it's always changing. And really what I'm fighting to keep stable in my thinking is thinking that my thinking is reality, when in fact the stability of reality has never changed. I'm actually a witness to it, but I'm relying again so much on thinking. Thinking has to conclude it because I think thinking is the creator of reality, that I miss the fact that I'm already of it, that if that exists, it's the nature of my ability to even think. And all I'm doing is over impressing on my own thinking something that becomes very depressing because it has no way out of this interminable cycle that I set it off on. And those are choices I make. Those things that I think are happening to me, I think that very conveniently because it aligns with my own denial that I'm creating it. Because what I think I'm creating is reality. I don't think clearly I'm creating a mess. If I'm creating reality, I'm certainly not the creator of obsessive thinking. I'm certainly not the creator of anxiety and stress and all the other potential conflicts that come out of it, because I am the creator of reality. See, what's interesting about that too, in terms of reason, I know enough to think of something, to think of reason or to think of reality as something that's absolute when it comes to my thinking, right? I have an absolute sense of what everybody else should think is what I think. It's interesting that I seem to know that. Why would I know that if I didn't know reality? I'm just misplacing.
Homo sapiens sapiens, the knowing knower. Not only do you know something, but you know something.
Exactly. But that I would say is a spiritual realm. And I don't use spirit as anything other than a word to point to something that doesn't seem to be physical, that doesn't seem to be within the bounds of time and space. And most of the dimensions that have been discovered or are talked about with physicists almost immediately transcend to infinite capacity beyond the fifth dimension, right?
Why is that?
I would say because it's the actual essence of what we're dealing with. That the first and the second and the third and the fourth dimension are all just small quantification. First of all, divisions of dimensions are human bound and made. There is no division between any of them within the reality because there is nothing divisible in something indivisible. So it's only what we think about them that we create those dimensions. But even within those dimensions we create, I think they're up to 11 or 12. That would mean that the first one, a single dimension, and a second dimension, which is the beginning of perspective and distance, and the third dimension, which is depth, and the fourth dimension, which is time and space, and the fifth dimension is the beginning to converge of all these things, and the sixth dimension is actually dealing with infinite reality. If it's infinite, it's not limited to the sixth dimension somewhere else. It must be where we are now. And I say must, not because it has to be, because it isn't, but it logically concludes that if it's infinite, it's where everything that is, and all that are, and it can't be distinct or separate or apart from, just must be, not because it has to be, again, not because I'm telling it, but simply that essence would be the essence. It would be pure and infinite and absolute and unchanging and a static that's unfathomable to a brain that's largely dealing with things that are constantly variable and in motion. Doesn't mean the brain is the sole arbiter of that either. And to think that it is, again, shows how much credit we give thinking, when in fact we don't give the due correctly to the consequences of the misstepped thinking or the mistaken thinking that we do, which is just another convenience of trying to make believe that if we don't admit it, it isn't happening. If we deny it, it's not happening. To deny something is to admit that thing being denied. If there's nothing to deny and we're denying it, we're trying to create something that doesn't even exist and claim that we can deny something that doesn't exist. What would we be denying but nothing? And that's exactly what we do in our own thinking. No wonder we feel haunted by these conjured images and have this seeming self-centered fear, have this anxiety, have this stress. Those wouldn't exist if we were operating at the level that would be commensurate with the actual level we are operating on, rather than simply what we're thinking about it.
Your Honor, I have no further questions.
So what about you in all this? We've been at this for a while. I don't know that you were introduced to this I used to talk about it, but largely I kept it to people I worked with individually, and I didn't make this public till 2 or 3 years ago when I started realizing that talking to a greater audience helped people to actually interact in an environment that would be more consistent and conducive to how they spent their days with other people and unexpected people and people that they didn't know well. And to be able to talk about this openly during the Sunday discussion is a chance to begin to bring it into the world we live in during the other 166 hours a week and start to interact on that basis and stop for a second and think about what's happening and see if we can't offer something that might be more meaningful than the pat on the back and telling people everything's going to be okay when we're helping reinforce ideas that are creating the not okayness that they're experiencing. So,
well, I'm accused of being unkind a lot. So, and I am, just looking at a jacket from my autobiography. I think 4 out of 5 people call it brutally honest. So, so it's funny every time we talk about that. But from what I have experienced with you is that the focus is so intense, and it has been since we've met. And so maybe that means you've taken me under your wing, so to speak, early, because we've had some discussions while I was drinking and you were not, but we have had some real deep discussions, and I've always enjoyed them. So me tagging along on your Sunday experience is been very good, and my limited relationship with David and conversations with you and David and I has been pretty exciting too. I think that I'm very, very interested in thought, and I that I have a disagreement with you about what comes first, the thought or the belief, and what has the power over us, and and all the make believe that occurs within these conversations. But I'm very, very interested, and I'm a coachable guy, right?
yeah.
So I really want to learn. And I'm a voracious kind of reader, so I'm when I find somebody who is interesting and thinks, I want to know how you think. And obviously that's not par for this course, because of thinking is about thinking, and so on and so forth. But that's my way of being inquisitive.
Well, some of the ways I reduce those sort of queries and those endless explorations is just to suggest that people think how they think, and reducing it to something that actually serves itself in terms of a sentence creates some stability and is also accurate, because people certainly think how they think, right?
Mm-hmm.
My suspicion is that what we're doing wrong, if it's causing so many of the similar side effects, the anxiety, the stress, and all that kind of stuff, it's probably very similar. And my other suspicion is that it's all based on making believe that we can turn what is false into truth.
There you go.
That we can have a thought that isn't true and turn it into true. The more we think about it, the more we insist on it, the more we act on it. And
Mm-hmm.
if that is it, the ultimate disease is to lying. And the allergy is to lying, because the allergy in alcoholism and other substance abuse programs is about, and other food and sex and gambling and all that, is all about an abnormal reaction. And what would an abnormal reaction to be to someone who uses something that's killing them, but to think the only thing they can do is use more of it to solve the problem? And it's exactly what happens within the thinking. It's centered in the thinking because all the compulsive, impulsive, and reactive behaviors all stem from thoughts. So if we can isolate one thing we're doing and start seeing that we may be mutating in different ways with different people at different times and different places, but the mutation is all based on one single misrepresentation of what we're doing, then we can look at that point, that focal point, and change all thinking, not by just correcting what we're doing wrong, but by beginning to see what is absolutely right and what is absolutely known and what is absolutely real. And I don't even think you need to add rightness into it for it to be real and truthful and a knowing awareness that we all share. Rightness would be determined by action. And my sense is an absolute state of being doesn't act. It is the realm of possibility for all actions and all things and all creations and all everything. Anything that's ever been created and everything that can be created comes from that bounty of infinite absolute knowing.
You want coffee?
Sure. I would like to perfect the delivery of that over Zoom.
Well, ask Amazon. They can do anything.
What's that?
Amazon they can do anything.
I'm losing you.
Right next to this machine.
Yeah.
Hello?
So let me turn this in your direction a little bit. In the time you've spent in the conversation, which has not been as long as obviously we've known each other, and you've been in conversations with me because I've always had conversations with people where I've wanted to learn and push the bounds, and people who are interested in exploring like you have always been interesting to me and always been engaging because it gives me a chance to sort of exercise my legs a little bit mentally. In your experience, which is now, again, a short period of time relative to that longer time we've known each other, what have you seen shift in terms of your own awareness? I know that you've told me a few of those things, but what do you see now that have changed that seem to be like keys fitting into the tumbler where it just connects and you kind of get it? You say, oh, and pretty soon you're not thinking too much about it because you have an awareness of it that isn't movable. It just, you start noticing it because you notice it as something that's there rather than something that you need to now believe in or think is there.
Breaking up a lot. I don't know why I'm standing.
What's that? I'm still, you're a little choppy.
My eagerness.
Okay,
So,
we stepped out a minute to get John's reception back.
how do you know was my reception? I'm being very receptive. What I'm learning to do is to question my motivation, and learning to, this is a very New York thing that you might not understand, but I'm learning to see around corners. So when a New Yorker like approaches a corner, and if he's aware, he's going to want to know what's on the other side of that corner before he approaches it. So I'm learning to do that in life, and I'm learning to question my motivation about why and how I encounter people. It's like trying to see what I'm up to, and that's been very helpful for me because I am at a place where at our age that I am losing some cognitive ability, and I need to really start to watch myself and watch what I'm thinking. And I've learned from you actually to recognize that I spend a whole lot of time thinking about my thinking. And that's been very, very, very helpful. You'll probably never know how helpful.
Oh, I'm very clear about it. I mean, I know my own shift and transition from that meant the difference between starting to witness my knowing and recognize that my observatory capacity had always been intact while I was so preoccupied thinking about my thinking as the solution, because I thought that it was the creator. I thought that it was literally my God. And I thought, it's interesting how often we think of God as something that gives and takes and hates and something we should fear, when in fact
you do, I don't.
well, often throughout history, those have been human characteristics assigned to God. And it's interesting that we would disavow the same characteristics that define our own pitiful, demoralized interactions with the self that doesn't exist and expand them to blame God and life and reality and truth as the cause of those things. And it shows how quickly we can turn from, if we're irresponsible in the seed of a thought, we're going to be irresponsible in all consequent thinking. And obsessive thinking gives the impression that all that's happening is what I'm thinking. So when you started noticing, and I remember you saying that you'd never really occurred to you that you think about your thinking. And that even noticing that has an enormous amount of clarity, because all of a sudden you can look at it as something you're doing rather than something happening to you, rather than something that can't be stopped. You can see it as something that you do by actually focusing on it and actually instigating it. And then the fact that choice, which always allows us not to choose, becomes obvious. You say, oh, I don't have to do that. And what do you get? A greater awareness. What's that awareness lead to? Very often awareness of other misgivings and other malfunctions and other problems that have been asking for attention but have been denied in the cavalcade of attempts to try to pretend what's happening isn't happening. And that, I would say, is real growth. The enormity, too, of beginning to witness absolute knowing is beginning to know we know when we know and not have to think about it at all, and realize that thinking is really a byproduct of knowing. Knowing is not a byproduct of thinking. And that, again, reverses things. Addiction is the attempt to make believe that truth and reality is all we think, because we think all we need to do is what we think. And when we do the wrong thing, constantly thinking it's going to get us better, we think somehow there's some truth in that thing that's going to be realized someday, somehow, somewhere. And more and more we do, we're proven over and over again that more is never enough, because enough is never enough, because there's nothing there to feed. There's absolutely nothing there but a thought. And it's the present thought I'm having about there being something in another thought somewhere else that's actually causing the conflict. So I'm, living awareness of that transition and seeing it in you is the thing that, to me, makes what I do. It confirms the value that may be in the value of what we all share, because it becomes obvious to people very quickly. Not because of how I say it, because I often say it in ways that are probably a lot less functional than I could. But I do my best to be clear.
Well, you say that a lot.
Well, I expect I could probably get better at dealing with this. I find the bigger the crowd, the more difficult it gets sometimes. And I find that I have some sensitivities to getting things across and wanting people to understand and hoping they do and all that kind of stuff. So my vulnerabilities haven't completely dissipated in terms of my thinking, but the actions I take on a broader basis give me a chance to begin to confront them by seeing them and making them more obvious than cowering in a corner and thinking that all that's happening is the narrow little view I have by trying to stay alone and away from people, than actually exposing myself to more people and exposing what I say to more people, regardless of how they think about it. So that's a learning curve in terms of just functional capacity. If I have the capacity and I'm not exercising it, then I've got some exercising to do and some practice to do and some discipline in that practice. Discipline isn't just abusive and trying to force me. It's trying to recognize that as I do something and it works, the discipline is to obviously reutilize what I already know and function on that basis, not as an excuse not to learn other things, but as a practical guide to beginning to allow things applied to work and to function and create the ease and the benefit and that sense of fulfillment that comes with anything that happens as a result of what I think accurately. There's very great satisfaction in that. Certainly, it's greater than the satisfaction I used to think I'd get by going great distances to try to find something that I thought was lost and then finally find it by getting it, whether it be a car or a girl or a house or whatever it was, and finding out that it didn't provide the thing I thought it was because the thing was a lie the whole time. I was using fantasy to imagine someday it will be that way. And the proof was always in a moment that wasn't happening, so I could deny what was happening, and the discontent and the irritability and all of the depreciated values that I'd experienced trying to get there, the anxiety and the stress and the drive and the ambition to try to get some other place until I realize it's me.
I resemble that remark.
Yeah, well, and you arrive saying, well, here I am once again thinking all the things that were dysfunctional to get me here. What am I going to experience here? Satisfaction and fullness? No. There's a gaping hole of awareness that becomes obvious. And to not see that as obvious is to not allow learning to occur. Wrong isn't something we shouldn't do. It's something that when it occurs, we immediately know something's wrong. It's a guidance system. It's like we're trying to cut something 7 inches long and we keep cutting it 8 inches. You know, the mistake is the correction. The mistake is the chance to adjust. Obsession says, I got to keep doing the same thing over and over again. And it's not only thinking I'll get a different result, it's knowing I'm going to get the same result that really makes it insane. Because I know better than to think if I keep cutting an 8-inch board and it's supposed to be 7, it's going to be 8 inches. And to think that somehow it's going to miraculously be 7 by continuing to do that is knowing it's never going to be 7 inches and continuing to do the same thing. That's the ultimate insanity. Expecting it would be different at least offers some vain hope. The other thing is a complete sense of awareness that I know what I'm doing, but I'm going to keep doing it anyhow because I think it's the only thing to do.
Do you think the addict has a better focus than the healthy individual?
I mean, I don't know if they have better focus. I would say that sensitivity is something that's consistent amongst people who suffer from addiction, and largely because they're aware that something's wrong. If they weren't aware, they wouldn't be acting out in ways that are so extreme to try to escape that desperation they think is real. And, you know, in a way, it's really an admission of a sentient nature. My sense is that sensitivity is actually intelligence for us. And to discount it as being something that is oversensitive is to discount intelligence as being too much, which I wouldn't say is really the best thinking, because I would say intelligence is exactly what we're offered in terms of our potential expression. And sensitivity is actually being aware of the intelligence we have as beings and the information we're getting that's raw data from our senses, constantly being fed into our system 24 hours a day. And if we're not responding to it and adjusting to it and acknowledging it, we're denying what's happening and wondering why things get worse. We're actually living in a fantasy world, making believe it's reality and wondering why we can't seem to. You can grow a tree in your mind, but you'll never eat the apples off of it. So you'll starve in that vein.
It's sometimes, you know, sensitivity. I have experience with people who to me seem actually thorny.
Thorny?
Meaning that thorny.
Yeah, they're
like
reactive.
Having thorns.
Yeah.
Because they are so reactive. And
Yeah.
I have been thorny in the past.
Yes.
And it's that hypersensitive thorniness that can get in the way of life.
Well, it's the exact reactivity by its nature is a defense. So it's a claim we're not doing what we're doing. We shouldn't be doing what we're doing. Now think of this.
Should is a judgment.
Yes. We're making a judgment that we shouldn't be doing what we're doing.
Right.
Now, the contempt of the judgment's not a problem because we make judgments all the time. It's the contempt of the judgment thinking it's right.
Well, that's the belief of the judgment.
Yeah. So it's a cycle. You can see how it's created. So if somebody is thorny, like I have been, it's because I'm protecting something. And what I want to give people the impression is that if they get close, they're going to get stuck with the barb. And so
you can feel it. It's not an impression. I can actually see it. You remember I told you that I can see color on people,
Mhm.
which was an asset actually. But I can actually see the thorns,
Mhm.
not just feel them, not just experience them. I can see them. I mean, they're 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 there. And yes, they're protecting something, whether they know it or not. I don't know,
Well,
but
I
they're
would say their
protecting
knowing
something.
of it is the reaction.
That's the thorniness.
Yes, we try to dismiss the things as we don't know it, which again supports the contention that we can only do what we're doing because we have no other choice. That's a way of saying we don't know. Those thorny reactions are a form of our awareness. They are a form of our knowing. We wouldn't be doing that if we didn't know what we were doing. Why would we be reacting and thorny if we didn't know that we were defending something? There would be
Yes.
nothing. There would be nothing. So we're really trying to argue in favor of not even existing, to make believe that what we're doing isn't what we're doing, and what we're doing isn't what we should be doing, while we're doing what we're doing and continue to do what we're doing in the name of thinking we shouldn't. Think of the conflict there. And that's a very addictive cycle.
Yeah.
I've got to stop drinking, but all I think about is the stopping rather than what I'm doing to start it. I don't think about the fact that it's when I pick it up that the whole cycle begins. It's not when I stop. I always stop when I drink too much, pass out, throw up, whatever it is. But it's the starting. And why is it starting? Because the moment's always new. All that's happening is in the present. All that can be done is in the present. If there is something broken in my thinking, where it's fixed is in the present, not in the past, because the past is the present. The present is the culmination of everything that's ever happened. So if we're looking for anything, it's always where we are. If we're looking for a solution, it's exactly where we are. If we're looking for a problem, we're going to create it exactly where we are. If we're perpetually creating a problem we think we can't stop, it's being done in the present, making believe it's about something or someone else that isn't here or some other place.
So that was there's a drawing on the wall here from 1989, a thorny drawing. That's what, not fair to the listener because they can't see it, but
think of
maybe
thorns.
thorns
Thorns in natures protect rodents and rabbits and all the other more vulnerable creatures because they can go into locations, they can kind of slip through, but they get little quiet spots in the forest where predators don't tend to come get them. Those are helpful when they're helpful, but to use them to try to hide something that's delusional and insane is to actually use them in exactly the opposite direction of what their normal purpose would be. So within the instinctive drive that we have to save ourselves from threats, the fight, flight, freeze, and fawn, which are the natural four so far identified, if I remember right. In addictive thinking, they're all reversed. The flight is the make-believe that we can escape into a compulsion. The fight is the idea that we can deny something and have it go away. The freezing is thinking we can become numb to what's wrong because we're feeling what's wrong and think by becoming numb, it's no longer wrong when in fact we're freezing it. And the fawn is all people pleasing, trying to buy people off, trying to give them the impression that not get near me, do not trigger me. I'm not going to be your friend if you trigger me. You're toxic to me, rather than saying, why would you be toxic to me if I wasn't toxic? Why would you be triggering something if I wasn't ready to pull the trigger? Why would I be afraid of any of that if I wasn't doing those things and then use you to excuse? The reversal of this thinking has us think everything else and everyone else and every other place and every other thing is happening to us, rather than actually we are intimately in the process of interreacting with it, interacting or interreacting with it. So that part of you thinking about your thinking that I remember you saying was the part that I remembered, because those little glimpses don't take a lot of thinking once you recognize it, but the awareness begins to shift dramatically because it's accurate. You're an observer. If you can see your thinking about your thinking, it means you're not your thinking, you're doing your thinking. You as the observer are actually watching your thinking. How could that be possible if you were the thinking? It wouldn't be possible. All you would be doing is thinking about your thinking. That's what obsessive thinking tries to have us think we're doing. But we're asking it to do that to justify our own unwillingness to simply concede who we are, where we are, as we are now. We're begging for things to go wrong to give the appearance that we don't know anything more than what we're doing, that it's all, the problems become happening, they're happening to us. They're not manifestations of our own creation to give us perspective to what we're doing wrong. They are happening to us and I can't solve them. And I'm well aware of those things in my world, my life, my experience. I don't like it, but it's my not liking of it that doesn't change how it is. And my beginning to like that I don't like it gives me a little freedom to start to cozy up to it and start to say, if I'm creating you, I want to own what I'm creating. I want to become responsible for, I want to act like I'm actually doing what I'm doing and start to dissolve that seeming interactive or interreactive relationship to something that I'm creating and then thinking I'm going to pretend I'm not doing. Causes major havoc on our psyche and systems.
Yes, sir.
So this has been good. I appreciate your questions, John, and I appreciate your challenges, and I appreciate you standing your ground to see things in ways that you think are critical to what you think, and I appreciate that. I don't feel any need to cater to that, and I want to do my best to always broaden their perspective, to pull beyond those things, not because I think they're wrong, but simply because I think you can have them freely without ever feeling condemned, and you can have them unknowingly without ever feeling you don't know, by seeing things in absolute terms and beginning to concede that it's actually the function of your absolute nature. It isn't an effort. It isn't a struggle. It doesn't even need to be defined for it to be what it is right now, as it is for us, how it is too.
And I'm not catering to you either.
Well, clearly the inability to deliver the coffee.
I offered more than you do.
Anyway, I love you. You're a good man. I appreciate knowing you. I appreciate being able to engage in this and allow other people to listen to a conversation that we might normally have alone somewhere, and be able to mention that this is something we're all doing together, if we're doing it at all. And I'm not suggesting everyone is doing this or everyone is doing it in the way we're talking about it, but that if you look at your own experience, there may be some window where more of what's actually happening becomes more obvious, and more of the potential for us to be influential in ways that are constructive for humanity would become a little more obvious. And this is something we each get to do on our own. We don't do it with each other. We're doing it in relation to one another constantly. But ultimately, we get to make that decision of yes or no. I want to consider this. I don't want to consider this. I've had enough. I haven't had enough. All those kind of decisions we make in our own choice. That's one of the freedoms we have. The individuation of us, I would say, is limited to that.
I thought it was an interesting exercise for
Yes.
I hope someone actually listens to it and we get some perspective on it, on how they saw it. I know people will get back to me, and I thank you for your time.
Well, and another point to your point is that ultimately, if there is any gain and any insight, the talking of it to others begins to confirm that they also have it, because you'll immediately see them either react or begin to concede. And you'll see that the growth of the difference between that will either increase by the perpetuation of the reactivity or diminish in terms of reactivity in relation to the concession of something absolute that we all share. The practice of this is the actual talking about it to others, not just listening and thinking to yourself, but actually engaging around it, even if you feel deficient in your ability. I feel that at times too, and I've done this a long time. I've not mastered this, but I always want to get better at it, because I would like to be better at communicating with people I'm with in ways that are useful and constructive and productive and valuable, for both of us, because what works in one way works in both ways when it comes to this infinite nature. It doesn't work it's a win-win for everybody, not just the people we're talking to. But the confirmation of it becomes the application of it, and doing that in your world. And it helped me start to see, when I did it in groups of people, how limited my talking points were, because I'd done it exclusively with one other person. I didn't have any distractions or any competition to their attention. And so doing it in public really gave me a different sense, which is where the discussion evolved from, so that we could start doing it in a more public way. And I think yesterday's discussion was great, because a bunch of people came who haven't come for a while, and it gave a little breadth to the thoughts, and also to the learning that's occurred over the time we've spent together. So I welcome everybody to do that. I welcome everybody to continue to listen. John, this is John's and my second interview where he's actually leading it, and I expect we'll do more. And anything you say out, under the contacts is an email. You're always welcome to email us and communicate with us and participate in the Sunday, 3 first Sundays of every month discussion if you'd like. Anyway, love to the world, peace as it is.
All right. Thank you.
You too.